Dr. Robert Eyler, who I've come to know in a lot of different iterations over the past couple of years that I've been doing this work, is president of Economic Forensic and Analytics, specializing in public policy and analysis. He is a professor of economics at Sonoma State University, earned his PhD from the University of California, Davis, and a BA in economics at CSU Chico. He's often called upon for his economic expertise and impact analysis, assisting private firms and public entities to help guide public policy. Robert is a Sonoma County native and also knows a fair bit about ranching, as his family has been sheep and cattle ranchers in Marin and Sonoma counties since 1910. Today, Dr. Eyler, who knows our region very well, will provide us with an overview and forecast of the macroeconomy, its impact on the North Coast counties, and some changes coming that may act as a challenge or an opportunity. Welcome.
Okay, so what I want to do, folks, is I want to do the following. I'm going to walk you through basically the macroeconomic situation, because the U.S. and California economies act as context for everywhere in California, so this place and moving north along the coast and in Lake County otherwise is no exception to that. As we do that, you're going to see a relatively decent forecast with some caveats, and then when we get to California in this region, as much as we want to think positively about the future, there are some major challenges that we have to think about, especially the more we move north along the coast. This is also true for Oregon's southern coastal communities. In thinking about population change, housing, the exposure to disasters, a bunch of different risks, but there are some potential niche opportunities that we have to think about. How do we blend the challenges and the opportunities together? As Marianne said, we want to do that at the end. I start people off thinking about the labor market. So the main reason we have not had a recession declared since May 2020 in the United States is because the labor market continues to provide jobs at the national level. These data, the blue line, is the evolution of jobs in the aggregate, meaning all the people that work in the United States. If you made them equal to 100 in November 2007, that's how long it took to get back to that same total number of workers. This is the Great Recession, and the reason I show you this is because I want to now contrast that to the pandemic and post-pandemic periods. So if you make January 2020 and the total number of workers in the United States equal to 100, that's where that black line starts on the left-hand side. And then since January 2020, we're now at about month 46 or 47. We're 2.9% higher than that number now. But notice that that black line has continued to get more positive, more positive, more positive, has not flattened completely or gone down yet since the bottom was hit basically in June 2020. We have no recession declared yet because this number keeps climbing. If that continues, we will not have a recession declared in the United States no matter how sluggish our economy goes, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, in contrast to that, we've had major problems with inflation. So hopefully you can see these data. I mean, you might be a little far away from it, but I'll walk you through it. These data are monthly data from January 2007 forward to July 2023. And the solid blue line on this graph is representative of the main price index that the Federal Reserve uses when it thinks about changing interest rates. It's called the Core Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, and that's a big mouthful for the following. Everything you put in your shopping cart and you buy every month has a certain price. If you pull food and energy out of that, food and energy, goods and services out of that shopping cart, you have what's called core expenditures. The price of that shopping cart 1 year ago is now compared to this month, 12 months hence, and that percentage change is that blue solid line on that graph. So you can see that from 2007 to about the early part of 2021, we basically wobbled around that dotted line, which I'll come back and talk about in a minute, and then we shot north of that in mid-2021 and stayed up there until about mid-2022, and we've been drifting down ever since from the peak. Well, an unfortunate aspect of drifting down from that peak is we paid for it with higher interest rates, and that's what the Federal Reserve is trying to do now, is trying to figure out whether or not that blue solid line, the current state of prices, the way they think about prices in the American economy, will drift closer to that blue dotted line, which is where they want that blue solid line to kind of weave around on average over the long period, or over the long term, I'm sorry, okay? The shaded areas are the two recessions since January 2007. The wide one is the Great Recession. The very skinny one is the one that was declared around the pandemic. And that shaded area is the forecast of where prices are going basically through the end of 2025. So the positive news is that we do expect inflation to continue to drift down. Higher interest rates are doing that, but the other penalty for higher interest rates is usually job loss. So the trickery for the Federal Reserve in saying, okay, our job is done in terms of increasing interest rates and pushing that blue solid line down through those red dots and having a trajectory that will continue to move that direction at least through 2025, is that the supposition is we will see job losses, which will lower demand and put more pressure on prices to come down. We have not seen those job losses yet. So that's why it's sort of lingering somewhere around 4% in terms of an inflation rate. Now, if you hear in the news, you almost never hear this price index in the news. What you hear is the so-called consumer price index. The consumer price index is a sampling of this price index. They both move very closely hand in hand in terms of their correlation. But when the Federal Reserve makes decisions, so for example, if you're worried about interest rates, they're watching this, not the CPI. Now, what's that mean? Well, as we move forward, we should see that continued downward momentum. The job losses aren't usually the opportunity cost for higher rates, so we're expecting that to happen. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, even if we push that number down, 2.5 or 3 years of relatively high inflation pinches two big groups simultaneously. One is our small to medium-sized businesses who have to deal with higher costs, rising wages, and just like lower to middle-income households, inflation is a regressive tax. So for our older fixed-income residents and for our smaller to medium-sized businesses normally locally owned, inflation is a pinch. Even if it goes away, those 2.5 years of higher cost are very hard to unwind. Once you give a wage increase, it is very hard to take it back, okay? And if wage increases are being driven by people going to the grocery store and seeing this kind of inflation when they fill their basket up, they're going to start asking their employers for a higher wage, or as we'll talk about later, they may migrate to places with more job opportunity and dynamics and potentially faster wages against the local cost of living. What's that mean for, not now, but 5 or 7 years from now in terms of available labor force and our local businesses? Keep that in mind. We shouldn't expect the Fed to lower rates until we see some job losses begin. In other words, they want to see the unemployment rate creep up a little faster. Believe it or not, that's the nasty part of the so-called dismal science, is you engage policy to fight one problem and you kind of get another as an opportunity cost. We'll see if that happens. And that the expectation is that index wants to move, to that blue solid line to move through those red dots. Okay? If they don't, rates will remain relatively high into the short to medium term. And we should not expect them to come down until we feel like we're kind of getting into a more sluggish economy. So that's, again, the nasty conundrum to solve here. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to show you briefly the evolution of interest rates as a signal that we may be on the precipice of a more sluggish economy. This blue line, which is here, this is monthly data from 1982 forward to actually earlier this month. I kind of took an average of where we were about a week ago. The blue line is the difference between 10-year Treasury securities, or what the government pays for longer-term debt as an interest rate, and short-term interest rates, primarily driven by Federal Reserve activity, but also by our want to put a little bit of cash to the side for maybe 1 year or 6 months, and what rate we're being paid at our local bank or credit union. Okay? That difference is that blue solid line. And when that blue solid line dips below the zero, the red dotted line, it suggests that banks and credit unions, or lenders in general, are now, for each dollar they lend out, paying more for that dollar than they're getting back. And if you know more technical aspects of finance, you can think of this as one version of a so-called inverted yield curve. And when the yield curve inverts, you can see somewhat maybe easily, every time that blue solid line has dipped below that red dotted line, a gray area is coming relatively soon thereafter in the time series. The gray area is a recession. So one of the main signals that financial economists, but generally macroeconomists like me, tend to watch is what's happening with that yield, or what we call that yield spread. And if it's dipping below zero and staying there for a long time, history suggests, and also basic financial theory suggests, the economy is going to slow down because credit provision is going to contract. It doesn't make economic sense for banks and credit unions to lend at a large volume into an environment in which they are not going to profit off each dollar they lend. Okay? Now, this is Federal Reserve action. This is the rate the Federal Reserve controls, and you can see that even though there's been kind of a choppy history from, let's say, 1982, after we had a double-dip recession, forward to 1990, since the mid-1990s, you can almost see a pattern to Federal Reserve rate changes. It looks like a cycle. And hence, for most of the last 3 decades, people sort of in a hand-wavy way have said that what the Federal Reserve does when it raises rates is pulls the punch bowl out of the party. Okay? When rates start to go up, a gray area starts to show its face relatively soon thereafter. Notice on the far right-hand side, which I'm now going to shade, okay? The black line, which is the Federal Reserve's so-called effective federal funds rate, the rate that they set or change when you hear that they've made a change, has gone basically vertical since March 2022, okay? So we're waiting for that black line to get back down, but because it controls that short-term rate very closely, that's what's pushed that blue line down so rapidly. They want to create a slower economy to slow inflation down. But one of the main reasons why we still have not got out of the idea that we may have recession in the very near future is this graph. Okay, so to wrap up on the macro side, the forecast looking forward is, at least can be summarized by the following numbers. The Federal Reserve in Philadelphia, the branch of the Federal Reserve there, does a forecast every quarter by asking 40 forecasters, hey, you watch the US economy every day of the week, what do you think is going to happen over the next few years? I pulled 3 variables out of that I think are the most germane to thinking about, A, what you probably know about the macroeconomy if you're a layperson, and B, sort of what drives the economy around. The first stop is real GDP growth, or income after inflation. What percentage change do we see on an annual basis of income after we take prices into account? And these data are from August. This is the latest. These are the latest numbers. That shaded area is called new, the latest forecast. Just to its left is the previous quarter's forecast. So a couple things stand out. One, for this year and next year, that forecast has actually gone up after 3 months, which is good. So there's some new signals just from May 2023 that the economy may actually be getting slightly better this year and slightly better next year. But then if you look at 25 and 26, it's getting slightly slower. So the supposition is that with lingering high rates, lingering high inflation, but still a pretty decent and frothy jobs market, we're going to have that pain distributed over a few years rather than have it compacted into a few quarters. Okay? Now the positive aspect of that is we may not have a so-called declared recession, which at the end I'll remind us that you shouldn't worry about that. But we're going to have a relatively slow, sluggish economy instead. If you look at the unemployment rate, this tells the story of we don't expect a whole lot of jobs loss. Notice that while, yeah, the unemployment rate is creeping up a little bit, from the previous quarter's forecast, it's actually crept down a little bit. And if you're in 4.2, 4.3% of the labor force unemployed at any one given time, historically speaking, those are amazing numbers. So it's very hard to complain about an economy that has positive growth in incomes after inflation and very low unemployment. Hence, we should not expect a recession declaration unless we see GDP growth go down very quickly or unemployment pick up very quickly, and they should follow each other. And the final stop is the inflation, or core PCE inflation. These are the red dots we just looked at in the graph before. Okay? So bottom line is that we do expect our economy to remain resilient, which is kind of baffling to me in the sense I thought we would see more job loss in California, which I'll explain in a minute. We've seen a little bit more than the remaining parts of the American economy. We've seen unemployment creep up a little bit faster. We've seen jobs slow down in terms of their growth a little bit more completely, but not to the point where we're actually thinking California is going to recess, quote unquote, vis-a-vis the other 49 states in some. Okay? And that's actually a very rare event to have an economy our size tied to so many other economies to recess individually with respect to other parts of the country. Okay? So don't expect that either. So, are we in recession? And the answer is not yet, right? We just got done talking about this. Low rates low rates immediately locked in a bunch of real estate at relatively low cost. So we have not seen an enormous number of properties go up and creating kind of another housing crisis. We somewhat expected that given the way rates went up, but a lot of refinancing activity and a lot of new loans when rates were really low has sort of locked in those rates, and we've stuck on inventory. Now, that has, just like everything else, an opportunity cost that it's made housing affordability even farther away for a lot of people, okay? The second part is we've seen those low labor force levels, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, driving a lot of the labor numbers. So we've seen people exit the labor force and not necessarily come back quickly. Now, they have started to come back. Higher wages, job opportunities, wanting to do some kind of work will naturally act as a magnet to bring people back to the workforce, but it's coming back at such a pace, it's basically just filling job opportunities. Thus, you're not getting a bunch of people swimming around looking for work. When they come in, they usually are finding a job. And we've relieved a lot of the global supply chain problems that were driving inflation from the other side of the equation. We still have a lot of demand-driven inflation. We no longer have as much of a supply problem as we had, let's say, in late 2020, early 21 that was starting to build up all this pressure in prices. That's somewhat been relieved. Now, will we have it, let's say, by the year end? If we get job losses in earnest, yes. If slower inflation means that you're going to have slightly lower business revenues and they're going to be hiring fewer workers, then the surge of people coming in looking for higher wages will not necessarily match the new job opportunities, and we will see that unemployment rate pick up. Anytime you have lower profitability, you generally see job losses, and we have that, like I said earlier, that trade-off with reducing inflation. We may also have some ripple effects from other parts of the world. So the Chinese economy is slowing down and has some relatively decent core problems now that they didn't have, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago. And the conundrum of what's going to happen in Eastern Europe and how that affects the global economy is still out there and may, in fact, worsen over the next 12 months, depending on what direction it goes. So there's a balancing act, and I'll talk more about that at the end as a wrap-up. What I want to do now is I want to talk about California and this area, thinking from Lake County, moving to the northwest and moving up toward the Oregon border. What are we looking at the next 5 or 7 years, and what are some of the economic underpinnings, not only in the post-pandemic period, but then thinking, what are the forecasts out there for certain items that we want to be watching when we think, what do we do from an economic and workforce and community development standpoint to plan? Okay, so what I want to start with, I want to start at the state level. This is the evolution first of the labor force in California from January 2010 on a monthly seasonally adjusted basis to should be August, even though the way that Excel and I played a little game, it only let me do September. But the bottom line is, it tells the same story regardless of my technical problems. You can see that there was a slow climb up, people coming from all over the world to live in California, people coming up in California, staying in California. The job market was very good in the wake of the Great Recession, and just kept on climbing. And then you can see the sharp cut when the pandemic hit, the labor force was lost. We saw some people come immediately back to work. And then there was another round of labor force change, which has yet to be completely explained. There's hypotheses out there, but don't get too caught up in that. That second round ended, and then we've been slowly climbing up ever since. But notice that blue line has not yet gotten back to its pre-pandemic peak. And in fact, is curled a little bit if you can just pick that out on the far right-hand side. This is the evolution of jobs and people working from that labor force in California over the same time period. So the shock to jobs was much larger than the shock to labor force. That's why the unemployment rate shot up in the initial stages of the pandemic. But then we recovered actually relatively quickly. Not that long of a time took place before we saw the economy turn back on in terms of in June 2020, you probably sitting at home going, I don't know when this is going to end. And then by September 2020, it basically was over in terms of the core economic impacts, and it had started to recover. Okay? However, if you think of true recovery, and how economists think about this is the following. You have recession, sorry, I didn't say that very well. You have recession, recovery, and then expansion. Notice that that orange line has not gotten back to its pre-pandemic peak either. So we are still technically in California in the recovery period, which if you go back and remember what I showed you in the first graph, the American economy on average is in expansion mode on jobs. We have not quite gotten back to that in California. Now, this is not a test, but please think about what might be creating that problem in California, because it is a macrocosm of what is going on in these 4 counties here. Okay, so hold on to that idea. If you look at what we're going to call non-farm growth, and every time I show this, I always have to give a caveat. The reason economists tend to focus on non-farm jobs and not inclusive of farm jobs is because when you look across a lot of metro areas, most of the California economy is driven by urban centers, which do not have a lot of farms. Even in places like Fresno, there is not a gigantic cattle farm downtown in Fresno, even though there's a lot of cattle, onion, pistachio in concentric circles around Fresno. So we tend to look at non-farm jobs as sort of the driving force around the economy, even though farmers are extremely important to our economy. Okay, so I needed to provide that caveat. As Marianne said, I come from a farm family, and sometimes I have to do that a little tongue-in-cheek. However, this is what it looks like from January 2020 forward. So you saw in the last graph we had not quite recovered yet. If we break California up into parts, the first 5 parts moving from top to bottom are California overall, okay? Then you move down and you can see Lake County, Humboldt County, Del Norte County, and Mendocino counties, and then a bunch of different metro areas otherwise. Counties like Butte and Marin have not recovered in terms of the people working in those counties yet. So they have lost labor force and they have lost employees inside businesses that live in those counties. That's what this means, is that people that are working inside the counties regardless of where they live. But you can see that for the North Coast, it's kind of a mixed bag, but generally been okay and positive. Humboldt County and Mendocino County have not yet recovered yet, but Del Norte and Lake have. Lake County actually was one of the very first counties in California to emerge in terms of recovering lost jobs and actually expanding from there. Okay? Now, if you know Lake County, how many people here are from Lake County? Okay. So if you know Lake County, you know that there was sort of a wink and a nod around mask mandates and some other issues when we hit. So, and this is also true kind of going up the I-5 corridor toward places like Shasta County. Shasta County was actually looking like the star recovery county in California. But if you went to downtown Redding in June or July 2020, there were fewer masks than people. Let's put it that way. So some of this picture is a function of where we had two things happen. One, there was sort of a wishy-washy way of looking at mask mandates and shutdowns in terms of how the communities followed that rule book. And the second is where people went to when they left the urban areas to find a home to live and find different opportunities because maybe they could have worked from home. And you can see that on the bottom four. Madera County, Imperial County, Tulare County, Kern County, and Riverside County all received people from Fresno, the greater LA area, Orange County, and they went out there. If you look at, for example, at the population in Los Angeles County, California, it is still down below where we were before the pandemic. And is one of the driving reasons why California has lost population on average. Okay, that's very hard to imagine, but it has happened. Some of them have moved out to those surrounding counties. Okay. So with that in mind, what I want to do now is I want to show you the labor force look, because it is in labor force that we have to kind of start our discussion about will the workforce be here for whatever our sort of general economic and workforce development planning is for these four counties and beyond over the next few years. So here's California's labor force, same basic picture rewritten, but notice, if you start the numbers in January 2010, seasonally adjust everybody, you get this slow climb, and we are still above where we were in January 2010, in California, for sure, no problem, okay? So let me just remind you, or let me just make sure I've got it defined. Labor force is the sum of folks that live in a certain place that are employed or actively seeking work and thus considered officially unemployed, okay? It doesn't mean you're not working. You might just not be counted the way we officially count it. So this is likely an undercount of the total amount of people that are actually engaged in some kind of employment, but watch what happens next. There's Humboldt County. From the official numbers that your elected officials see, that your state is publishing as a description of Humboldt County, that's what the number of people employed and unemployed officially look like, okay? Now, we're going to come back and talk about some conundra that exist to help explain this, so hold on to that. But watch a pattern starting to develop. Here's Lake County. Here's Del Norte, and here's Mendocino, okay? If you live in this area, this maybe looks shocking on the surface, but if you give yourself 10 seconds to think, that's probably not that shocking, okay? But we know there's more economic activity than these numbers would suggest, okay? There are two maybe related ideas as to why that's true. Anybody want to take a guess? What's the number one reason that's probably true? And in a sense, there's more economic activity than this decrease in the number of people employed or unemployed might suggest. It's cannabis. So cannabis number one, and second is cash payments for a bunch of people that aren't officially seen as unemployed. And those may be related ideas, okay? So I'm going to say this later again because I really want to hammer this point home. Your official employment data for these counties, while published every month diligently by California EDD and the Bureau of Labor Statistics in DC, do not count cannabis jobs as official jobs yet, okay? So keep that in mind. These are understatements, but boy, do they paint a really weird picture when a politician looks at that, and that's why I'm showing you this contrast. Okay, so make sure you hammer home with your electeds, while this is what's officially published, we know there's more happening than this, and we still, but the cool thing is this tells you we need support. Okay, and there is the sort of pandemic and post-pandemic initial move in terms of California, and you can see it really didn't change much for these counties. Okay, but let's look and see what's happened at sort of a higher level industrial sectors look. So since August 2022, we've had some decent growth. I showed you that in the last graph. Here's what's happened in California from a goods producing standpoint. So if you take construction, manufacturing, and agriculture and you jam them together, you get what an economist would call good producing industries. And for the most part, that has grown over the last year, except for Lake County. But you could say that the jobs in Lake County maybe sagged a little bit because there was such a surge in construction initially that that's faded just a little bit. Okay? Here's services producing. So we've seen that kind of pick up a little bit in certain areas. Lake County, it's sagged again, and that's because we probably saw a lot of pickup. And then here is government. So if you look left to right, California has seen positive growth of those jobs over the last year, and it's been a pretty decent year of jobs growth in California, even though it's slowed down a little bit from 2021. Lake County's been more of a mix. We've seen a little bit more comeback of government, mainly in teachers. And then in Humboldt, we've seen it pick up. The investment that's happening at Cal Poly Humboldt will continue to provide some gains. How that's shaped will ultimately define how the sort of concentric circles around that investment affect the rest of the communities in Humboldt County. Del Norte is a little bit more of a mixed bag in terms of seeing government sag a little bit, but then you've seen construction and services otherwise pick up. And Mendocino County is kind of flat as a pancake over the last 12 months. If you run around in Ukiah or on the coast, that also is not necessarily a shocker, but we need to think, okay, maybe that's just last year. Okay, well, let's look at since January 2020. So in January 2020, this is what's happened on the goods producing side. A lot of this is construction. A little sprinkle of it's manufacturing and ag. But as I'm going to say in a minute, cannabis is not included here. Okay? Here's services producing that's outside of government and the private sector, which is also kind of a mixed bag in terms of the growth since 2020. You can see Mendocino County is actually down a little bit and also down in government basically across the board. One of the things that happened in government, and it's kind of somewhat tied to each other. If you're trying to get construction projects done, we've seen government change in terms of the number of workers there, and a lot of local and state branches of government, and even who I work for at Sonoma State University as a microcosm of the state university system, we've seen people retire. So we've just got a smaller group of people doing government work. So one of the big things going forward is if we're going to try to get things done where we need permitting processes, or we're going to need some kind of inspection or something to happen otherwise, including cannabis, how's that going to work if we have fewer and fewer people participating in government jobs and that they're maybe not as trained as old personnel who at least had the institutional history to know what to do next? So once again, cannabis is not here yet. And until cannabis is nationalized in a legal fashion, it's hard to imagine there will be actual governmental tracking of cannabis jobs in terms of an official data point, because you won't have a national analog to compare. Once that happens, though, the BLS is already. We have all the coding, everything's set up. It's almost like we have the spreadsheet with 7 or 8 different rows that are blank, just waiting to hit go, and then they'll all fill up really quickly. We'll see. Okay, so that then takes us to thinking about wages and the incomes that are derived in California. So one thing about wages that we know wages have gone up, okay, in terms of what people are paid. The trickiness is that we want to know what they look like after we take inflation into consideration, because economists don't care what you're paid on your paycheck. We care about what you have after the cost of living is taken into consideration. So I'm going to show you the data from 2008 forward to kind of take into account the Great Recession and how wacky that was in terms of the growth of wages, and then thinking about what's happened since the post-pandemic period. So you can see those two periods. This is, again, monthly data. That's what the wage growth in California has looked like. So if you take inflation into account, we had a lot of zaniness during that wide gray area, the so-called Great Recession. We should have expected that. We finally started to flatten out and get a little bit more running in parallel with the labor market. Notice that basically after 2012, it looks very similar to the graphs we've seen about the California economy. Real wages kind of just crept up in pace with jobs. That's exactly what you want. You don't want inflation rising too quickly. Wages keep pace. Wages at some point hopefully will eclipse the growth of inflation, which happened basically at the beginning of 2015. And they stayed above that, meaning you saw real gains to incomes, which means you also saw real gains to median household income, generally speaking, after 2015 when you take inflation into consideration. Now, if you look at the far right-hand side, the great thing about having so much economic wackiness right after the pandemic is you saw quick gains to wages. And you may remember, and this sounds like, we were just every day in this slugfest, especially if you were a small or medium-sized business owner. I don't want to raise wages. I don't want to raise wages. I don't want to raise wages. I got to raise wages. Can't find anybody, right? We tried all kinds of tricks of, let me give you a cash payment to work for me, but I only want you to do 16 bucks an hour. Then it was like, give me the cash payment and I need 19 bucks an hour. Once that wage kicks, that's the trick, and that's what happened. You can see in that relatively decent period after that skinny gray area, we had positive wage gains after inflation. And then once inflation kicked, the slide started. Because inflation was so rapid, labor markets were not able to keep up, and there was resistance, which is classically the case. If you're a business owner, the last thing you want to do is start giving these jumps to wages, because if inflation slows down, if we think it's somewhat anomalous that inflation's happening at that height it's happening, I don't want to give you a wage increase, have inflation drop, and then now I cannot unwind that wage increase. I kind of want it to walk in step. Well, unfortunately, what that means is that for folks that are wage earners, about the last 24 months, you've actually lost purchasing power with the current wage at the median. Okay? So inflation, the other way to think about that is inflation has basically increased faster than your wage. But that has crept up. So as inflation has come down and the labor market still is somewhat frothy, wages are continuing to rise, and inflation slowing down means we're getting closer to that break-even point, but we're still under break-even for about the last 2 years. Okay? Now, why is that important, you might ask? Well, if we look regionally, I'm going to show you these data moving through a bunch of different parts of Northern California to see a bunch of different examples. So this is what the 2019 median wage was for these areas. And the areas here, if you just can't quite see it, moving left to right, are Marin County, Napa County, Sonoma County, San Francisco County, the state on average, then the North Coast as a blend. Because the way it's reported, unfortunately, these counties are not broken out on their own in terms of wages. The cool thing is for the 4 counties that are in the room, it is that one group. We call it the North Coast. And then Shasta County as thinking about a Northern California, somewhat related industrial mix, short of the coastline stuff, as these 4 counties, okay? Okay, so that's the geography. Let me explain the way the numbers are gonna go. This is the 2019 median wage adjusted to 2023 dollars, meaning that I go back in time and say, if that wage was paid now, how much would it be given all the inflation stuff we know and all the labor changes we know? Watch what happens. In 2020, the wage actually crept up a little bit. We should have expected that. It's the exact same phenomenon I just told you. Employers were trying to reattract workers. The easiest way to reattract somebody is to pay them more in some shape or form. When workers did not want a cash payment to go back to work, they took a higher wage because businesses started to walk down that road after they couldn't bring enough workers back. 2021, the inflation started to kick, and for most of these areas, except for Shasta County and San Francisco, we actually saw a decrease in that real wage, and then finally, this is what it is in 2023. So for the North Coast, we've actually seen that real wage kick back up, which has been good. The reason is because the labor market here is struggling to find workers and wages are slowly creeping up against inflation, and for right now, it's outpacing it versus a lot of other places, including the state on average, which slipped a little bit last year too. So inflation is a major driver in the way we think about how wages are asked for by employees, how much we can afford as small to medium-sized businesses when inflation is going up against the other costs of doing business, and how competitive we can really be on both sides of that market. Okay, so watch for that, but for right now, this area is actually performing relatively well on behalf of workers. Now, with that said, what's happening to the cost of living? Well, one of the major parts of the cost of living changing is housing prices. So I'm going to show you a picture that's somewhat of a contrast. This is what's happened for the areas we're going to show here, and moving left to right, this is California, San Francisco, Sonoma, Marin, Shasta, Napa, Humboldt, Lake, Del Norte, and Trinity, basically descending in size after the state for the ones I want to include. So think Bay Area, moving north, and then moving a little bit east. This first graph is what's happened in the last 12 months to median home prices. So we've actually seen a little bit of relief over the last 12 months, and this is as of August. The September data is going to come out, well, they come out in about 2 weeks. But anyway, that's where we are right now. Now, if you look at the 2-year run, this is what it looks like, and there's some very weird contrasts here. The county and city of San Francisco has not seen housing prices recover yet at the median level since the shock of the pandemic. Why? Because basically supply exceeds demand. People have not moved back to the city after they moved away, and it's still hard to sell a house at the current price in San Francisco. We will see how that changes. But San Francisco is an anomaly across California. You can see the other areas here, the last 2 years, even taking into consideration the negative growth or the drop in prices over the last 12 months, remain positive. But why are we so concerned about housing affordability? It's the 3-year run. So over the last 3 years, there's been relatively robust growth. Even if you look at north, like think Trinity County and then move east towards the northeastern counties of California, the housing price changes have been less robust. But a 3-year run of 20 to 30% in housing prices, especially when the last 12 months have been negative, is a pretty amazing growth rate run. Okay? It's not historic, and even in 2022, when these numbers were actually closer to 35 and 40 across the board in 2 years, was still not historic, but was getting close on it. So if you're renting and you were waiting to buy a home and you were saying, okay, great, recession has now come, we saved a bunch of money, and then within 2 months of the recession hitting in 2020, housing prices had gone up about 7 or 8%. Why? Because people suddenly said, well, I don't want to rent in the city anymore because I don't need to live here. I have low interest rates. Let's move to Bakersfield with gigabit Wi-Fi. It's dusty and it's hot. That's fine because now we've got 3 times the size of the house for basically the same monthly payment as we had in LA for a 1,400 square foot apartment. So that's the game that got played somewhat en masse. And if I showed you Bakersfield, you'd see that black line was about 42%. Okay, so Bakersfield, Santa Barbara, Madera, all have had this amazing housing market run in terms of housing prices. But what that does, and again, from a nasty science point of view, it's exacerbated housing affordability issues. This is the forecast. If I'd shown you this 4 months ago, almost all of these were negative. Well, now they've all gone slightly positive, except for 3 counties in specific, Trinity, Humboldt, and Mendocino, which are on the far right-hand side, unfortunately. Lake County you can just see as this little nub right on the other side of Sonoma County, which I have as negative 0.1. The twist point in these data, there's 46 counties here. The twist point is Sonoma County. So Sonoma, San Francisco, Trinity, Humboldt, and Mendocino are the only 5 counties right now with a current forecast negative home prices over the next year, but at 0.1%, that's basically, a margin of error and more. That's not that big of a deal. Napa's at 1.7% as just thinking about a positive county that's close, especially if you're in Lake County. And then Riverside County, you can see on the far right-hand side, looks like it's going to continue its very positive run. Riverside's about 42% growth over the last 3 years. Now in compounding way will be almost 50 by the end of next year if everything plays out the way this forecast suggests. So, and if you think about that, look at the far left-hand side, look at those counties that exist there except for Santa Barbara. All basically Central Valley, I-5, Highway 99, the LA basin moved there and pumped up that demand, okay? Okay, and that's also true for Santa Barbara in terms of the wealthy. So, good forecast if you're an owner, a continued poor forecast if you're a renter trying to own. And a lot more exacerbation on wages and cost of living otherwise, potentially here in California. Okay, so let's transition to talking about the blue economy and kind of how economists see the blue economy and how to define it. There are some really strong lessons from Europe. Europe is about 10 or 15 years ahead of us on this, more or less. Things like ocean energy, shipbuilding, aquaculture, tourism that's related to the coastlines and really the ocean generally, fisheries, marine biotechnology, thinking about how we can gain access to medicine coming out of the ocean, transport otherwise, so think shipping generally. Those are kind of the big sectors that the European market that calls itself the blue economy looks at. And so what we want to do is we want to think, okay, if that's true, whoop, I went too fast. If that's true, if we're trying to build a culture, especially in Humboldt County, around the blue economy, what's that going to mean in terms of jobs? And where should we look first to sort of build the foundation of that blue economy that then will spread its wings throughout the rest of the region if possible? All right, we'll start with, here are the status quo forecasts for Lake, Humboldt, Mendocino, Del Norte counties, and a couple other places, just looking at the change in non-farm employment from before the pandemic to 2030. So if I took the forecast and I said, okay, this is where we were in 2019, what's the percentage change? Right now, economic forecasts for the state of California suggest that Del Norte County is going to lose jobs going forward toward 2030, okay? Now, whether that means there's some shock at the prison, whether it means some other change in Del Norte County, we don't know yet. The forecasters almost never say one event is going to take place that's going to lead to this, because that's getting very, very crystal ball-y. But Del Norte's got probably more general threats of job loss Humboldt slightly behind it, but not too much, only very little change there, which is funny because these forecasters knew the investment was coming to Cal Poly Humboldt when this was published. Then Mendocino and Lake County, which actually look pretty robust. If you look at what the rest of the North Bay, thinking the most connected areas to Mendocino and Lake County are, that's kind of following suit. So some of that is seeing both Mendocino and Lake County as getting a ripple effect from the growth of Sonoma and Napa, but also in general just thinking of a lower cost place to live and how that might lead to more economic development. That's kind of what's behind these status quo forecasts. Okay, so these come from three places. They come from the California Department of Finance when they're doing economic forecasting for the state. They come from Caltrans when Caltrans is doing economic forecasting to think about what to do for transportation. And then I kind of blend those two and a couple other items that I think about in a couple other private sector forecasts that I kind of jam together to come up with the final one. If we look at more details, a lot of these forecasts are being driven by goods-producing industries. Now, they won't tell you this, and it's nowhere to be found, but it's possible what they're thinking behind the scenes is when cannabis actually goes live, the agriculture, which is goods, remember I told you earlier, agriculture, construction, and manufacturing are goods-producing industries in any economy. If cannabis suddenly goes live, is that where we're really going to get the pop? If that's true, and nobody will tell you if that's true or not, but it does seem intriguing that of all these counties, Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino, and Lake have this very robust change in things that are either agricultural, construction, or manufacturing based, without really a big change coming otherwise. This will be a change in the data, but not necessarily a change in the everyday movements on the ground. Okay? So if you see these forecasts later, I wanted to provide you that caveat. Be careful. Okay? Services and government, not much change there at all, except in Marin County, which is kind of funny because Marin County is one of the worst growing economies right now in California in terms of jobs. It's one of the best in terms of housing price change, taxable sales changes, and median household income. Okay? So a wealthier, older audience, just as a foreshadowing of a general theme for Northern California that I'm going to tell you at the end, is moving in concentric circles out of the core Bay Area toward more suburban areas. Okay? But the cool thing is, and let's move back just one slide real quick, that is not a terrible picture unless it is 100% driven by an industry that's already here on the ground and is not going to give us any change. So this is not taking into account any blue economy changes, any sort of diversification movements, none of that. So the cool thing about a status quo forecast that looks like this is we can improve on what might already be a pretty decent situation looking forward. Okay, but how do we really take advantage of the blue economy? My take is this, is that you have to focus on the science side of it. Why? Because science jobs are going to come in two different ways that are really nice for local economies. One, they are generally much higher paid than average jobs. They come with a higher level of education. They come generally from an outside source as initially funded, which means they want to make that investment locally. And they may come in the following ways. So these are kind of the big jobs in blue economy jobs in terms of thinking about, if you think about the merger of workforce and economic development and the science side of it, these are kind of the 6 major occupational categories that should have some growth to reflect the merger of those two movements, if it's done right. So some kind of oceanography, engineering, ecology, geology, energy that comes out of the ocean, it's generally hand-wavy called marine energy, and then some kind of biotechnology. Using Cal Poly Humboldt as a centerpiece for either generating more workers to work under those scientists or to provide at least the nuts and bolts of a support system if that science arrives is absolutely critical. If that doesn't happen, what you think is going to be the blue economy in Humboldt County and maybe spreading its wings down to Mendocino and up toward Del Norte, and I'll talk about Lake County's participation about this at the end, will not happen at a very robust rate. You're going to need outside funding and you're going to need some general commitment toward this on campus at Cal Poly. Okay? Now, why is this good? Well, the median wage for these jobs is generally $14 more than the median wage at the current region-wide median. That's almost a 55% increase if you think about jobs that are converted from some job otherwise into a job that's science-based or science-supporting. Okay? Only about 1.1% of the jobs in this region, in these 4 counties, are science-based, period. Not marine science-based, but have any scientific connection. That's inclusive of all the scientists that are professors at Cal Poly also. Okay? And California generally pays about $9 more on average for that. So the cool thing is if those show up here, they're going to pay more than the state does already, which is going to be attractive to workers. But you got to figure out whether or not these areas are attractive to businesses and workers simultaneously. Okay, so let's now talk about what's been happening demographically. So if you think about what the forecast looks like on the worker side, it looks okay, assuming that that's not all 100%. We are expecting cannabis to go live in these data, and we're going to have this surge that really doesn't mean anything on the ground because it's already happening. Okay, let's assume that that's not true for now. What is true is California has lost population. So I'm going to walk you through the demography of California, and then I'm going to show you the local demography. The components of change in California are a macrocosm of components of change that have happened regionally, meaning the 4 components of change for any population, categorically speaking, are new babies, folks that pass on, folks that came in net from other countries that we didn't shove over to other countries. So when I move to Italy one of these days and call it a day, if somebody comes from Italy, that's net 0 change, right? When I go, it's negative. And then we're going to have migration domestically away from our area in net. People come in, it's positive. We go away, it's negative. This is births. This is people that passed on in California. This is fiscal year 1999-2000 to the last fiscal year the data provide, which is last fiscal year, meaning 21-22. This is inbound migration in net from other countries. California has constantly been a magnet for the world to work. Okay? And in some cases, we've had to bring in those workers for more wages because we didn't have enough engineers, let's say, and we were more than willing to pay more to have them come in. It was more than they were making no other way where they were, sorry, that was terrible English. Wherever they started, we certainly were paying them more, much better. Here's the big problem, is out-migration to other places. Why has California lost population, which is the black line? When that black line goes below the 0 line, it means your population is actually going down in total amount. We lost because people went to other states in the United States. Okay? Where did they go? Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Idaho, Nevada to a certain extent, Oregon and Washington. Why did they leave? Go ahead. Okay, boy, you guys are pretty good on that one. So they left because of housing. But let me give you a little piece of trivia. The number of occupied housing units in California actually increased during that time. What happened? Not quite. That's an unoccupied housing unit. Not quite. Think about the people that live inside that housing unit, right? So people left, and people came in. Smaller housing unit, smaller composition of people inside the house, which means they are or older. They're older. Generally speaking, if you look at the data, they're older. So we traded a family of 4 for a retired family of 2. Okay? Population down, occupied housing units up, demand for housing up, housing prices up, while population is sinking. Whoa. Right? If you look at all the data together, that's the best visual confirmed estimate of what's going on. Okay? Have a look at people that are working jobs. I'm going to take it back. I don't need to go down that road. We are getting older. Okay? The data also suggests that workers are getting older. We've almost doubled the percentage of people working over the age of 65 in California. 2 reasons. 1, we have gotten older, so the population over 65 has increased. But 2nd, people can't afford to stay in California without a job after 65, so they're working. So we've got housing affordability issues. We have workforce development issues. We have people that we used to think would have been retired and would have opened a job for somebody else that aren't here. And that can exacerbate duration of unemployment in our younger people, depending on what job those folks have. Okay. Here's the population forecast for a bunch of different places. Here we go. So this is Del Norte County's population growth over from 2019 to 2040. This is the current forecast that the Department of Finance is using to tell your elected officials in Sacramento what's going to happen in Del Norte County. This is Humboldt. This is Lake. Notice Lake has kind of held firm in the short term, but is also being forecasted to fall as we creep closer to 2030 toward 2040. Why? What's going to happen naturally over the next 7 or 8 years in places like Lake County too? You're going to age too. Mendocino looks like this. Then we look at Napa, Sonoma, and California. So California, if you think the graph I just showed you is maybe like a 2 or 3 year anomaly that's based on the pandemic, it's not. Okay? Why? Because we're trading young for old. Okay? Okay. What's the implication of that? The implication of that's the following. A change in the number of kids in school. So Department of Finance and Department of Education in California are both work on an annual forecast of the number of kids in school and maybe more importantly, the number of new high school graduates in each county in California. I'm showing you K through 12 because usually when you think of quality of life, you think weather, general amenities, and school quality. Well, if we're losing students, we're also going to, at least in the current formalization, we're going to lose some investment short of the private sector coming in and filling that gap of a lot of our school districts. This is what it looks like for these counties that are here. You can see California's down about 9% toward 10 years from the latest data. So think the last data we have, because it just ended, academic year 21-22, looking forward 10 years to 2031-32, down about 9% across the state, K through 12 attendance. Up in Trinity and Lake County. Why? Because some folks have moved there with families for the time being, and that will suddenly play out. But those are also very small places in terms of the surge is coming from a small base number. And then everything else I'm showing you here, Shasta, Mendocino, Del Norte, Humboldt, moving left to right, Napa, and Sonoma. Sonoma down 15% over the next 10 years in the current forecast. There's already been some school district consolidation in Sonoma County, and boy, they're fighting tooth and nail. So we'll see how this goes. But what's that mean? The implications are these, generally speaking. Labor force concerns. So if you want a blue economy, you got to be thinking, well, what's going to happen from a labor force standpoint that's going to provide me the workers to support that growing economy, and who's going to make a $500 billion investment in the private sector to parallel what's going to happen at Cal Poly Humboldt to grow that blue economy in such a way that there's synergistic effects. Who's going to make that bet? If we can't find workers and we don't have a wide enough breadth of available workers between 18 and 65 to basically go into those jobs. Recruiting from the outside and moving those folks to these 4 counties has shown itself to be a decades-long problem to solve. Okay, short of people coming here to retire. Whoops, sorry. We have all kinds of concentric circles around that. What's that mean for our local businesses? What's that mean for teachers and retaining our teachers in K through 12? And can we attract more families to these 4 counties? So these are some broader puzzles to solve, thinking about where things are going. We think there's going to be economic growth, and we think that there's an engine using, again, Cal Poly Humboldt as one way of thinking about a statewide, outside the county investment in a place to grow. We should see some more private sector investment. But if you think about the way that the last 25 years have evolved, moving from Lake County and then moving northwest, it has been a slow, steady, reactive move. It's absolutely essential that you think about these things and be proactive about economic and workforce development to get ahead of what will naturally be an aging global workforce that now says, I don't want to work anymore and I want to go to a place that's relatively inexpensive with relatively good amenities. Coastlines are natural attractants to people for retirement. Okay? Not necessarily to come and work. The cool thing is that science wants to go just about anywhere. So where are the opportunities? We know there's opportunities. If you think about wind farming and sustainable energy, there's going to be more movement on energy products over time. That is a really nice niche market. We should see engineering come out of that. We should see maybe these areas become a place of best practices. One of the best things you can do is say, this is why we're better than any place in the world. If you can achieve that, you will be an attractant to a bunch of different scientific industries. That continued investment, both on the private and public side, has to happen, and that synergy between higher education and the private sector is critical. Okay? And for all 4 of these counties to actually gain access to growth, it has to work as kind of a spider web out from wherever that investment lands. But some of the challenges are, how do you get here easily? So once you're here, do you want your life to be in a 40-mile radius, or do you want to have more options? So does that mean an airport expansion? Does that mean some kind of ferry system from San Francisco? Does it mean thinking a little bit out of the box about moving people from more populated areas to this area? And then what are the political and neighborhood ramifications if that happens? There are some people, this might be a shocker to you, in these 4 counties that don't want a lot of change. On the cannabis side, how do we solve the cannabis conundrum? Well, one of them, and I kind of tried to be funny here, is we got to give some niche. We have to find some way of getting out of the dreadlock Rastafarian way of cannabis into something that's more global and more adult in terms of what people want to do on a regular basis. There's people in a hot tub every Friday night using edibles, smoking weed. It's been going on for decades. I know I shocked you. We know that's happening. We need to figure out a way where it migrates a little closer, maybe never getting there, but a little bit closer to the wine industry if you want all that sort of global niche. So I've been working on a 2-year project at Sonoma State with Cal Poly Humboldt on the economic impact of the cannabis industry in Lake, Mendocino, Trinity, Humboldt, Del Norte, and Sonoma counties. The number one thing that I've run into is a lot of friction has happened over the last 2 or 3 years, and it's been a nasty time to do a study like this. But one thing that just keeps popping in my head is that can we get to something that just looks at it in a more, I don't want to say corporate, but in a slightly more professional way, seizing the entrepreneurship that's happened here for decades? How can we keep that niche, right? So if Humboldt and Mendocino counties see themselves as sort of the global leaders in cannabis innovation, we have to tell that story, but that story has to be saleable in terms of product. So we have problems of how do we legally move that niche product, like we move Napa and Sonoma wines worldwide, if we can't even barely move it over the border without worrying the sheriff showing up. Where will people come from, and how will Lake County engage? And at the bottom, well, that's perfect because that's the end of it anyway, but that's fine if you're able to put it back on. There we go. I did a study in Lake County about 5 years ago, and I always thought the lake as a place of science would be a great thing because Clear Lake is a really nice asset that is somewhat unique to Lake County. And the UC Santa Barbara actually has this limnology program, believe it or not, where scientists study lakes. So is there a way of thinking about the blue economy going to a place that has no coastline? In Lake County, the lake can act as that sort of additional piece of science. Got to utilize that. How much of that has happened to date since I left Lake County? Unfortunately, it's zero. But it doesn't mean it can't happen, especially, again, if that sort of spider web, those concentric circles radiate out from a place where the investment's naturally coming. So folks, with that, I'll take your questions if we have time. Thank you so much for having me today, and I hope that was helpful.